The first thing she said to me was not a greeting. It wasn't a threat either, though it carried the weight of one. It was a warning issued by someone who had run out of the energy required for threats, and what she said, what she whispered actually, with her back against the bulkhead, and 3 fingers pressed to the wound in her side, was this: "Human, you must never touch me." I stood there in the corridor of a ship I had no business being on, holding a medkit I had no authority to deploy, listening to the sound of something large and wet moving in the vents above us, and I did not ask her why. I had enough situational awareness left to understand that the why was complicated, that the why was probably the entire reason I was here and the entire reason she was bleeding, and that the why would take longer to explain than either of us had. I just said, "Okay." She looked at me with those eyes, pale silver, shot through with threads of bioluminescent gold that pulsed faintly with her heartbeat, and I don't think she'd expected that answer. I think she'd expected me to argue, or to insist, or to do what every other species in the known galaxy apparently does when a V3 queen gives them an instruction. Question it, negotiate around it, treat it as an opening position rather than a statement of fact. I just said okay. And then I sat down cross-legged on the floor 2 meters away from her, opened my medkit, and started sorting through what I had. My name is Caleb Marsh. At the time of the events I'm describing, I was 34 years old, a second-tier field medic attached to the UEA's Outer Survey Division, and I had been in some genuinely bad situations before. I'd worked a mining collapse on Kessel Station. I'd triaged casualties after the Dreth incursion at Farput. I'd once spent 11 days in a life pod in the dark between 2 star systems with nothing but protein bars, a busted oxygen recycler, and a copy of a detective novel I'd already read 4 times. None of that prepared me for the V3 Queen. Nothing prepares you for the V3 Queen. The V3 are, and I am choosing my words carefully here, because the UEA's Xenodiplomacy Office has very specific guidelines about how human civilians are supposed to describe our allied species, and I have already violated enough regulations for 1 lifetime. The V3 are not like us. They are not human-shaped beings with different skin tones and funny foreheads. They are not secretly relatable once you get past the surface strangeness. They are genuinely, fundamentally, cosmologically different from us in ways that took our best xenobiologists nearly 20 years to begin to understand, and which I, a field medic from New Edmonton who barely passed xenospecies basics, did not understand at all. What I knew, practically speaking, the V3 are a matrilineal empire spanning 19 star systems. Their queens are not figureheads. They are biological command nodes, literal neural anchors for their fleets, their armies, their entire social architecture. A V3 queen doesn't just rule. She is, in some electrochemical sense that I will not pretend to fully comprehend, the living substrate through which her people think. When a queen gives a command, it doesn't travel through a chain of communication. It is felt. Her generals feel it like a shift in gravity. Her soldiers feel it like a change in temperature. Her people feel it the way you feel the sun come out from behind a cloud. This also meant, and here was the part that was relevant to my immediate situation, that a wounded queen was an existential crisis. Not just for her, for everyone connected to her. I'd come aboard the V3 Dreadnought Severath not as a diplomat or a soldier, or even, technically, as a medic. I'd come aboard because my survey shuttle had been caught in the same spatial compression event that had crippled the Severath, and because the emergency bridge between our vessels, a temporary atmospheric seal spun up by the V3 damage control systems when they detected a pressurized hull nearby, had deposited me in the ship's mid-corridor before I had any real say in the matter. The compression event, that's what the V3 called it. Our astrophysicists, the few who'd survived the initial wave, called it a fold in the fabric of navigable space, a place where 2 regions of the galaxy had been pressed together like pages in a wet book. Ships that hit the boundary were squeezed. Systems failed. bulkheads buckled. And sometimes, if the geometry was exactly wrong, you ended up somewhere that wasn't quite where you'd been, connected by a bridge of spinning air to a ship full of beings who had not expected to share their emergency with a human. I had been unconscious for, I estimated, about 6 minutes. When I came to, I was lying on a floor made of a material that felt like polished bone and looked like the inside of a nautilus shell, iridescent white curves, smooth under my palms, slightly warm. The lighting was dim and blue-green, the color of deep water, and there was a sound in the vents that I initially mistook for a pressure leak but which had a rhythm to it, a patient, wet, searching rhythm that pressure leaks do not have. I sat up. I grabbed my medkit. It had come through the bridge with me, still attached to my belt, which I counted as a minor miracle. I got to my feet. I did a slow 360 assessment of my immediate environment. Corridor, curved walls, no obvious exits visible from where I was standing, a faint trail of something dark and wet on the floor leading around a bend. I followed it. I found her around the bend. Queen Vithra Sev, commanding officer of the Severath and sovereign of the 7th Meridian Fleet, was not how I'd imagined a V3 queen would look. In the UEA briefing materials, which I had read exactly once during mandatory xenospecies orientation while also eating a sandwich, the V3 queens were described as regal, imposing, surrounded by ceremonial attendants, moving through their ships in formal processions. The briefing materials had photographs. The photographs showed tall beings robed in layered materials that caught light and threw it back in colors that human cameras couldn't quite resolve, standing at the centers of vast chambers with their arms extended, and their chins elevated, and their bioluminescent markings blazing in complex, shifting patterns that represented, apparently, their rank and lineage and current emotional state all at once. What I found against the bulkhead was none of that. She was tall. V3 are always tall, even in extremis, but she was hunched, one shoulder dropped, 3 fingers of her left hand pressed hard against a wound in her right side that had soaked through the outer layer of her uniform and was continuing, slowly and steadily, to soak through the layer beneath it. Her markings, which on a healthy queen would have been blazing, were dim and irregular, flickering like a signal trying to maintain frequency through interference. Her silver-gold eyes were open but focused somewhere past me, somewhere the corridor didn't go. She didn't see me for a moment, and in that moment I saw something I hadn't expected to see on the face of a being described in every xenodiplomacy document as inherently imperious and emotionally inaccessible. I saw exhaustion, deep, bone-level exhaustion. The kind you see on people who have been holding something up for a very long time and have recently discovered that their arms have run out of strength. Then she saw me, and her eyes came into focus, and what I saw in them was not fear. The V3 do not appear to experience fear in the way we do, or if they do, they don't show it in their faces, but something I could only describe as a very precise, very controlled form of alarm. "Human," she said. "Yeah," I said. "You must never touch me," she said. And I said okay. The thing in the vents was called a Reth call. I didn't know that at the time. I learned it later, along with a great many other things I would have found useful to know earlier. At the time, what I knew was that the sound it made was wrong in a way that my nervous system registered before my conscious mind caught up. A deep mammalian wrongness, the sound of a predator that is not in a hurry because it doesn't need to be. "Is that what wounded you?" I asked, not looking up from my medkit inventory. I was counting supplies. It calmed me down. Numbers calmed me down. She was quiet for long enough that I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "Yes." "Is it going to come through the vents?" "Eventually." "How long?" "I don't know. It's damaged too. The compression event." She paused. Her breathing was careful and measured, the way people breathe when they're managing pain rather than ignoring it. "It was my hunting companion, before." I looked up at that. "It was yours." Rethkal are bonded to their handlers. When my compound guard was killed in the initial event, the bond broke. An unbonded Rethkal is, she stopped, started again. It is no longer the creature it was. Okay, I said. I looked at my medkit. V3 physiology. What did I know about V3 physiology? I knew they were bilateral, hexadactyl, with a cardiovascular system that ran copper-based rather than iron-based, which meant their blood was blue-green when oxygenated and darkened toward black when not. I knew their major organs occupied a different distribution than human organs, higher center of mass, redundant respiratory system, a secondary circulatory loop that fed the bioluminescent tissue. I knew that their skin, which looked from a distance like human skin with a faintly opalescent sheen, was at close range clearly not skin at all in any sense a human biologist would recognize. It was a layered membrane system, the outermost layer of which was the bioluminescent display tissue, and the layer beneath that was. The layer beneath that. The no-touching rule, I said. Is it about the display tissue? She looked at me. The gold threads in her eyes pulsed once slowly. You know what the display tissue is, she said. It wasn't a question. I know it's where your bioluminescent markings are. I know it's how you communicate rank and emotional state to your people. I know it's neurologically connected to the command functions you perform for your fleet. I paused. I don't know much more than that. She was quiet again. In the vents, the wet searching sound moved, shifted position, went still. The display tissue of a V3 queen is not simply aesthetic, she said, finally. It is the primary interface through which I maintain contact with my fleet, my people. It is how we are connected. When a queen is wounded, the display tissue becomes. She searched for a word, unstable, hypersensitive. An unmediated contact from an outside organism can transmit through the interface in ways that are, another pause, unpredictable. Unpredictable how? The last time a non-V3 organism touched a wounded queen's display tissue, she said, 14,000 of her people lost consciousness simultaneously. 3,000 did not regain it. I put down the hemostatic pad I'd been examining. Right, I said. So you understand. I understand. In the vents, the Rethkal moved again, closer now. Her name, the part of her name that a human could produce with human speech organs, was Save. I didn't know that for a while. V3 queens don't typically offer their names to people they've just met in bleeding emergencies, and I didn't ask, because I have some instinct for which questions to save. But somewhere in the second hour, when I'd made 2 failed attempts to fashion a pressure dressing that could be applied without touching her display tissue, and the Rethkal had twice tested the integrity of the vent grill at the corridor's north end and found it lacking, she told me. Save, she said, out of nowhere. Caleb, I said. Caleb, she said it carefully, tasting the syllables. An old word in one of your early languages. Dog, I said. It means dog, or it might mean faithful depending on which etymology you believe. My mother thought it was faithful. My father always pointed out it was dog. I paused. He wasn't wrong. Something happened in her face. Not a smile. V3 facial expressions don't map onto human ones cleanly, and I've been told not to try to interpret them as if they did. But something shifted in the configuration of her features that felt, to my thoroughly unqualified human perception, like a very small and very controlled amusement. Your father was perceptive, she said. He had his moments. I went back to the problem of the pressure dressing. The wound was in her right side below the lower rib analog, in a region that, based on what I remembered from Xenospecies basics and supplemented by frantic review of the medkit's onboard reference module, housed her secondary circulatory junction. In a human, a wound that deep and that steady would be threatening but manageable. In a V3, the secondary circulation fed the bioluminescent tissue network, which meant the wound wasn't just making her bleed, it was making her dim. Every hour her markings flickered a little lower, and I understood now what that meant. Not just for her, for the thousands of people connected to her through that tissue. "How many people on the ship?" I asked. 407, she said, before the event. "Yes. And now?" A pause. "Fewer." I worked on the dressing. The medkit's reference module had almost nothing on V3 wound care. What it had was a single page, clearly written by someone who'd had access to very limited V3 medical literature, which noted: 1. Standard coagulants are ineffective on copper-based blood chemistry. 2. V3 tissue rejects synthetic adhesives at the cellular level. And 3. Direct contact with the display tissue layer in a wounded queen is strongly contraindicated. Strongly contraindicated. That was how my medkit phrased it. Strongly contraindicated. 3,000 people who didn't wake up. Strongly contraindicated. I looked at what I had. I looked at the wound. I thought about the geometry of the problem. And I thought about something my field surgery instructor had told me a long time ago in a basement classroom on Earth with bad lighting and institutional coffee. The body knows how to heal. Your job is to get out of the way and not make things worse. Sometimes the most important thing you do is nothing. Sometimes the most important thing you do is give the body the one small piece it's missing, and then leave it alone to do the rest. The one small piece. I started going through my kit with a different eye. The reth call came through the vent grill at hour 3. I heard it before I saw it, a sound like wet tearing, like something that had been patient for a very long time and had decided patience was done. The grill deformed inward, the metal crumpling rather than breaking, and then the thing was in the corridor, and I was between it and Save because that was where I happened to be standing when it came through, and I had approximately 2 seconds to assess it. It was about 2 meters at the shoulder. That was the first thing I registered, not the iridescence of its scales or the geometry of its 4-part jaw or the way its eyes caught the corridor light and gave nothing back. Just the size. 2 meters at the shoulder meant it could cover the corridor's width without trying. 2 meters at the shoulder meant running was not a viable option. The second thing I registered, it was damaged, moving wrong. One of its front limbs had a hitch in it, a compensation, a place where the normal fluid predator mechanics had been interrupted. The compression event had done something to it, not enough to stop it, enough to matter. The third thing, it was looking at Save, not at me. I was in the way, but I wasn't the target. The bond had broken, but something of the bond was still there, still pulling, still making this animal circle back to the thing it had been oriented around for its entire life. And now that thing had changed into something terrifying and alien, and it needed to be resolved. I understood that in a way. That feeling of something you trusted turning incomprehensible. That pull back toward the source even when the source is the danger. I understood it more than I'd have liked to. I didn't have a weapon. What I had was a medkit and whatever I could reach in the time I had. And what I could reach was the heavy-duty bone-coring biopsy probe clipped to the kit's outside panel. A tool designed to punch through dense alien tissue for sample extraction, about 30 centimeters long, dense enough to hurt something if you hit the right spot with the right intent. I hit it twice in the damaged limb. It turned toward me. I ran. Not away. Toward the curve in the corridor, the one I'd come from, the one that led back toward the emergency bridge with my shuttle on the other end. I needed it following me, not standing in the corridor trying to figure out how to get around me to reach Save. And the only thing I had going for me was that I was fast, that I was heading somewhere specific, and that the reth call's damage made it fractionally slower than it should have been. Fractionally slower than a 2-meter apex predator was still extremely fast. I did not look back. I could hear it behind me, the wet rhythm of its movement, the slight compensation on the damaged side, and I ran the way I'd learned to run in the field, without the waste of panic, just the efficient physics of a body moving as fast as it was capable of moving toward a destination. The bridge was still open, the atmospheric seal still held. I hit the threshold and went through and spun around and the wraith call stopped. It stood at the threshold and it didn't cross. It lowered its head, its four-part jaw working, its eyes doing something I couldn't interpret, and it stood there in the V3 corridor on the other side of the atmospheric seal and looked at me standing in the docking tube between two ships in a fold of compressed space, and it didn't cross. I stood there breathing hard, watching it. After a moment I understood. The bridge was between states, not quite V3 ship and not quite human shuttle. A liminal space, neither one thing nor the other, and the wraith call, an animal, a bonded creature built around the logic of defined space and defined allegiance, couldn't navigate that threshold without a direction to follow and a bond to pull it through. I'd been in a sleep science center on Earth once, briefly, during a mandatory medical rotation. The researchers there had described a concept I hadn't thought about since. The idea that nightmares exist in the transitional state between sleeping and waking, that they are creatures of thresholds, that they can follow you to the edge of waking but cannot cross into full consciousness because consciousness has a coherence that the threshold does not. The wraith call stood at the threshold and could not cross. I went back to save. She was still upright, which I had not been certain of. Her markings were dimmer. Her breathing was shallower. The wound had soaked through the second layer now, and her hand, still pressed against it, was dark with blood almost the color of engine oil. "It's contained," I said, "for now." She looked at me. The gold in her eyes was still there, still pulsing, but the pulse was slower than it had been. "You let it away." "Yes." "It didn't follow you through the bridge." "No." She processed this. "Why not?" "Because it's a bonded creature. Bonds have geometry. You were its anchor. I took it to a place that wasn't your ship and wasn't my ship, and it didn't know what to do with that." I paused. "At least that's my theory. I'm a medic, not a xenobiologist." Something in her face did the thing again. The small, controlled thing that I was beginning, carefully, to identify as something in the neighborhood of wry acknowledgement. "You are an unusual human," she said. "I'm a pretty ordinary human," I said. "That's the theory anyway." I sat back down 2 meters away and looked at the wound. The dressing idea I'd been working on before the wraith call interrupted us was still in the back of my mind, turning slowly, resolving into something more specific. "I want to try something," I said. "With your wound, I need to explain it first, and I need you to tell me if it violates the rule." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, explain." "The rule is about contact with the display tissue. Direct contact from an outside organism. What if the contact isn't direct? What if there's an intermediate layer?" "Define intermediate layer." "I have a wound irrigation sleeve in this kit. It's designed for contaminated wounds. You thread it into the wound channel and irrigate from inside out, so the contaminating agent comes out rather than going deeper in. It's not adhesive. It doesn't touch the outer surface. It goes below the display tissue layer entirely and acts on the underlying wound without ever making contact with the interface." I paused. "In theory." Save was quiet for a long time. "You've never done this on a V3 before," she said. "I've never done this on a V3 before. You don't know if the sleeve material will be tolerated." "I don't. But it's inert polymer, non-reactive. If your cells reject it, the rejection process will take longer than we have before the blood loss becomes critical, and the rejection itself won't involve the display tissue." I paused again. "I'm not telling you it's safe. I'm telling you it's safer than the alternatives I've been able to think of." She looked at me for a long time. "And if it fails," she said, "then we were out of good options anyway." Another long silence. In the distance, not just in the vents now, but somewhere in the ship's larger architecture, in the hull stress and the dying power systems, I could hear the Severath coming apart slowly. The compression event had done structural damage throughout. We had time, but not infinite time. "You said explain," she said. Not ask permission. I know. But you asked. Yes. She thought about that. The gold in her eyes pulsed. Once, twice, slow and irregular, the heartbeat of someone fighting to maintain something very large over a very long distance. Do it, she said. The procedure took 41 minutes. I worked in the 2-meter boundary I'd established at the beginning, not because I needed to, not because the rule required physical distance rather than simply the avoidance of display tissue contact, but because I wanted to honor the geometry of it. She had given me a rule and a reason and a degree of trust that I did not take lightly. So I worked carefully, and I narrated what I was doing, and I gave her the chance to stop me at each step, and she didn't stop me. The sleeve went in at 23 minutes. I felt the moment it seated correctly, a feedback through the tool handle, a small mechanical certainty. Save's breathing changed, not worsened, changed, like something that had been held too tight had been allowed to release by a fraction. I started the irrigation cycle. Copper-based blood, dark as deep water, ran out of the wound channel and across the iridescent floor, and I monitored the flow and adjusted the pressure, and did not look at her face because I needed to stay focused on what my hands were doing, on the numbers the medkit was giving me, on the sound of her breathing that told me more than the numbers did. At minute 37, her markings changed. Not dimmed, not flickered. They shifted, a new pattern, not the irregular emergency flicker I'd been watching for 3 hours, but something more organized, more intentional. A slow wave of light moving from her core outward through the display tissue, spreading across the visible surface of her skin like sunrise moving across water, gold and silver, and something between them that I didn't have a color word for. I stopped working. I just looked at it. I'd seen a lot of things in my years in outer survey. Gas giants from low orbit, a bioluminescent migration event on Kessel Station's ocean moon, where the creatures moved in columns of light so bright you could read by them from the station deck. I'd seen a binary star system rise over a frozen plateau on a moon that had no name yet, just a catalog number. None of it had looked like this. She was communicating. That's what I understood watching it. The pattern was language, not a language I could read, but language with the grammar of light and position and rhythm, intricate and precise and beautiful in the way that all precise things are beautiful when they are operating as they should, when the mechanism that was broken has been restored and the function flows through it again. She was talking to her fleet. She was telling them she was alive. At minute 41, I withdrew the sleeve and sealed the access point with the one material in my kit that V3 tissue would tolerate. I'd found a note deep in the reference module, easy to miss, about a polymer compound developed for the V3 liaison program that had been added to standard OSD medkits 18 months ago, which I had never had occasion to use before and which was, it turned out, exactly what I needed. The wound was not healed. It would need real V3 medicine to heal, and it would leave a scar, and the display tissue over it would probably never fully recover its range of expression. But the bleeding had stopped. The secondary circulatory junction was stabilized. The immediate threat was controlled. I sat back and let out a breath I had been holding, in some form, for 4 hours. Caleb. Her voice had changed. The exhaustion was still there, but underneath it now was something else. Something I'd heard in voices before when a critical patient stabilizes, not relief exactly, not yet, but the first small evidence that relief might be available. Yeah. You should know, when my markings changed, what you saw. I figured it was communication, to your fleet. Yes, but also, she paused, the pattern that originates in stabilization. When a queen's display tissue recovers from damage, the first expression is involuntary. It is the most accurate translation I have. It is gratitude, not expressed to anyone specifically. Simply released, because the body needs to release it. I thought about that. Your body said thank you. In the most fundamental way that I am capable of saying it, yes. I looked at the floor between us. The iridescent surface of the V3 ship, bone white and nautilus curved, now marked with the trace of dark blood from a wound that was no longer bleeding. "You're welcome," I said. The rescue came 6 hours later. The V3 fast courier Renarath, dispatched when the Severath's automated beacon finally fought through the spatial compression enough to transmit, arrived at the fold boundary and deployed a standard recovery team with full medical capability. The UEA monitoring station at Grid Point 77 had, independently, flagged the compression event and dispatched a search and recovery shuttle. Both arrived within 40 minutes of each other, which I was told later was an unusual degree of cross-species coordination for an unscheduled emergency, and which I suspected was related to what SAVE's markings had been doing for the last 6 hours. I was standing in the docking tube when the V3 medical team came through. There were 6 of them, moving with the precise economy of beings who knew exactly what they were doing and where, and they passed me without stopping except for one. The team leader, who paused, assessed me the way you assess something unexpected in a familiar environment, and then inclined her head. Not a bow, but something, an acknowledgement. I stepped back and let them work. The Reth call was still at the threshold when the V3 secondary team came through with what I could only describe as a specialized piece of equipment that I didn't understand and didn't ask about. Whatever they did with it was quick, and I thought, merciful. The animal needed resolution more than it needed to survive in the state it was in, and the V3 understood that. An unbonded creature, a thing trying to return to an anchor that had become something it couldn't process. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The UEA recovery shuttle took me off the docking tube about 20 minutes after the V3 medical team finished their initial stabilization work. I was processed through standard post-incident protocol physical assessment, psych eval, a long conversation with a very tired OSD coordinator who kept asking if I was certain I hadn't made contact with the Queen's display tissue, and who seemed baffled by my continued certainty that I hadn't. I filed my incident report. I listed my equipment usage. I noted in the materials section that the V3 liaison polymer compound had performed as described and suggested it be restocked in all OSD medkits as a priority item rather than a supplemental addition. I did not, in my initial report, mention the thing I kept thinking about on the way back. The involuntary expression of gratitude, blazing gold and silver through the dark of a wounded ship. The language of a being saying thank you in the only way her body knew how to say it, not to anyone, just to the fact of being alive, just to the small piece that had been provided at the right moment, and the hands that had left her alone to do the rest. I mentioned it later, in a different kind of report filed with a different office, which I had not previously known existed, the UEA Bureau of Xenocultural Interface, whose mandate I discovered was exactly what it sounded like. I learned more about the Rethkal afterward, about what they are when they're whole. In V3 culture, and this is in the public literature now, so I'm not disclosing anything protected, Rethkal are bonded at the handler's adolescence and kept for life. The bond is not a leash. It's not training. It's a relationship, in the full sense of the word, a relationship with an animal so neurologically integrated with its handler that they share a kind of peripheral awareness. The Queen's compound guard who had been killed in the compression event had bonded that Rethkal at age 14. He had been 31 at his death. 17 years. The animal had spent the 6 hours between his death and its own resolution, trying to find a way back to something that no longer existed in the form it needed. And it had tried that return through the only route available to it, through the Queen who was still alive, still present, still part of the architecture of the world it understood. I thought about that for a long time. About what it means to be built around a connection, to be neurologically organized around a bond, about what happens when that bond breaks, about the difference between the wound itself and the echo of it, the unbonded state that follows, the creature who is not quite itself anymore and cannot explain why. The V3 Bureau of Xenocultural Interface contacted me 8 weeks after the incident. They wanted to talk about the wound irrigation procedure, about the geometry of the approach, not touching the thing that was dangerous to touch, finding the one path that worked within the constraint rather than around it. About what a human had understood in a crisis, about a V3 queen's physiology that the queen's own people might not have thought to attempt, because the constraint was so deeply embedded in their culture that they couldn't see past it to the workaround. They also wanted to talk about the Reth call at the threshold, about what I had understood about bonded creatures and threshold spaces that had led me to use the docking tube rather than trying to fight or flee. I told them I hadn't fully understood it. I told them I'd been operating on instinct and a half-remembered conversation about nightmares and waking states from a medical rotation, that I'd mostly spent thinking about other things. The bureau officer who interviewed me, a V3 herself, a civilian bureaucrat about as far from a queen as you could get while still being V3, was quiet for a long time after I said that. Then she said, "Do you know the V3 phrase for what you did?" I said I didn't. She said it translates approximately as the lucid action, the action taken from a clear-eyed state without the distortion of fear or convention. We have a word for beings capable of this. It does not translate precisely into your language. The closest approximation would be something like one who moves through the threshold without being captured by it. I thought about that. A dream walker, I said. She looked at me. You know this concept. From somewhere else, I said, from a different context. But yes. I saw Save once more. Not officially, not through any channel that the UEA Bureau of Xenocultural Interface organized or the OSD approved. It was 8 months after the incident, during a resupply stop at V3 Station Meridian, where I'd been transferred for a 6-month posting that I suspected was not coincidental. I was eating alone in the station's shared mess, a large, dim space designed to accommodate beings with a range of sensory preferences, which meant it was quiet and comfortable for humans by accident, when someone sat down across from me. She was taller than she'd been lying against the bulkhead. She looked like what she was, a V3 queen in recovery, not full recovery, not the ceremonial blazing figure from the briefing documents, but a being who had been through something significant and had come out the other side of it with new information. Her markings were somewhat dimmer than I imagined they had once been. Over the sealed wound site, slightly visible above the line of her uniform, the display tissue had recovered partially but not completely. The pattern there was simplified, like a word written in a hand still learning to write. She sat down and looked at me. "Caleb," she said. "Save," I said. I find myself uncertain how to begin. "That happens to me constantly," I said. "I usually just start in the middle and work backward." She considered this. "I am told that you did not mention, in your initial report, the nature of the first expressive cycle." "No." "Why not?" I thought about how to answer that. It felt private, I said finally. It felt like something that happened between the two of us in a specific moment, not between the UEA Outer Survey Division and the V3 7th Meridian Fleet. I paused. "I reported it later, to the right office." "I know, I read the report." She paused. "You described it accurately." "I tried." "You wrote, it was like watching a system come back online, like the first boot sequence of something that had been dark for too long." "I remember." "That is an accurate description, but it is also more than that. The first expressive cycle after a destabilization event is considered among my people to be, there is not a clean translation. Sacred is too strong, Private is too simple. She looked at her hands, hexadactyl, lightly iridescent, folded on the table between us. Witnessed would be the closest word. To witness, it is to be made part of something that is not usually seen. I sat with that for a moment. I didn't know that at the time, I said. No, but you treated it as though you did. You didn't report it immediately. You didn't make it part of the official account. You found a way to record it that honored its nature. She paused. That is a human quality I have been trying to understand since the incident. The instinct for what should and should not be made public. The understanding that some things belong to the moment in which they occurred. Some people would say that's just discretion. Some people would say so, yes. We sat in the quiet of the shared mess for a while. The station's environmental systems hummed. A V3 maintenance worker moved through the far end of the room without looking at us. The Reth call, I said. Yes. Was there anything to be done, if it had survived? She was quiet for long enough that I thought I'd miscalculated the question. Then she said, a bond can be retransferred. It is a rare procedure. It requires a handler who is willing to accept the transition period during which the animal's behavior is, as you observed, erratic and dangerous. She paused. There are very few who would take on an animal in that state. But it's possible. It is possible. Good, I said. I didn't explain why I thought this was good. She didn't ask me to. I came to tell you something, she said. Okay. What you did on the Severath, the procedure, the Reth call, the 6 hours between the compression event and the rescue. She paused. My people have been trying to understand how a human field medic accomplished what he accomplished using a medkit reference module and insufficient training. The Bureau of Xenocultural Interface has spent 8 months on this question. I heard. Their conclusion, she said, is that you understood not consciously, not through training, but through some form of practical intuition, a principle that the V3 have never successfully transmitted to non-V3 species. The principle of lucid action, moving through the threshold without being captured by it. She looked at me directly. We don't understand how you knew. I thought about it. I didn't know, I said. I just didn't panic. I had a medkit and a problem and I worked through the problem. I paused. I think that's mostly what humans are. We're not smarter than most species. We're not stronger. We're not better navigators or better politicians or better fighters. We're just really stubborn about working through the problem with whatever we have. I paused again. We spend half our lives in states we don't fully understand, dreaming, trying to figure out what the dreams mean, trying to stay lucid in the parts that feel like nightmares. I looked at my hands. Maybe that prepares us for threshold spaces. Save looked at me for a long time. The gold in her eyes pulsed, once steady. Perhaps, she said. I went back to the outer survey division after the Meridian posting. Different sector, different ship, different medkit with exactly 1 tube of V3 liaison polymer compound in it, which I made sure was never depleted. I filed one more document with the Bureau of Xenocultural Interface before I left, a supplemental note to my original report, classified at the level they'd assigned to the rest of it. In it, I described, as accurately as I could, what it had been like to watch the first expressive cycle, the way it had moved through her, the way the light had spread like sunrise over water in the dark of a dying ship, and what it had looked like from 2 meters away, from the required distance, from the only angle available to a being who had honored a rule without fully understanding it. I wrote, I think the distance was right, not because the rule required it, but because some things need to be witnessed from outside them to be seen at all. I was outside. I had the angle. I saw it. I didn't know if that would be useful to anyone. But I thought it was worth saying, in a document that would be read by people trying to understand what passed between 2 species in a threshold space. 6 hours, 1 wound, 1 rule, and the small human quality of staying lucid enough to find the one path that worked, and then getting out of the way. I thought it was worth saying that sometimes the most important thing you do is nothing. And sometimes what you do with the nothing is exactly enough. Save was not in the mess when I left. She had not said goodbye, which I had come to understand was not an oversight. The V3 do not say goodbye in the way we do. It implies a severance, a closing of the connection, and the V3, who understand better than most what it costs when connections are severed, prefer a different convention. They say until the next threshold. She had not said it, but as I walked out of the mess and down the corridor toward the docking bay, I thought I felt, not heard, not saw, but felt something at the edge of perception, a warmth at the frequency of gold light, a thing my body registered before my conscious mind caught up. I didn't look back. I figured she'd be there at the next threshold. I figured that was enough.